Hello Magic Makers, welcome to Storytime with Mombierella. This is a young adult fiction and may be inappropriate for some younger viewers.
The Beast Within, A Tale of Beauty's Prince by Serena Valentino. Copyright Disney Enterprises Incorporated, 2014. Chapter 8, The Wilting Flower. The next day, Princess Tulip Morningstar and the prince shared a very quiet breakfast together in the morning room. She didn't ask the prince where he had been the night before, or why he had missed dinner. She had been forced to dine with the maestro by herself, and was mortified when he inquired where the prince might have been, and she couldn't answer. She wanted to rail on him, honestly. Inwardly, she was seething, but Nanny warned her never to let her anger show. It wasn't ladylike to appear upset. Nanny said that far too often a woman unknowingly sabotaged herself when reproaching her husband for his misdeeds. To stay quiet and say nothing was reproach itself. But to say something only gave him reason to turn the situation onto the lady, claiming that she was overly emotional and making more of the situation than needed, causing him to become angry with her. Tulip didn't understand this entirely, but she did notice that Nanny didn't follow her own advice, and thought perhaps that was why Nanny had never married. So she said nothing. The only sounds in the room were those of the dishes clanking and the birds singing outside the lovely morning room windows. The room was made entirely of paned windows, and had the most breathtaking view of the garden. Tulip thought of herself in the future, sitting here looking out these windows by the hour, languishing. She wished the prince would say something, anything to break this silence. She couldn't think of what to say. Anything she said would surely sound reproachful, and her tone, she wasn't at all positive it could be tempered. She just sat there drinking her tea and picking at her scone, waiting for him to speak. And while waiting, she thought about that girl she'd met at the ball. Oh, what was her name? It was pretty, rather musical. She was probably the sort of girl who would rebuke the prince in a situation like this, demand, in fact, to know where the prince had been the night before. Then again, the girl with the pretty name was probably not the sort of girl a prince would want to marry. She sighed. Her thoughts were halted with the sound of his voice at last.
Tulip.
Her eyes brightened when she heard him say her name. Yes, she responded, hoping he would at last make his amends for stealing away the previous night and leaving her alone to listen to the maestro talk endlessly about his art.
We'd better not keep the maestro waiting.
Her heart sank. Of course. Shall we go to the rose garden?
Yes, I suppose we shall.
The rest of the week went very much the same. Tulip Morningstar pouted and played with the castle's cat. The maestro gesticulated wildly while making grand speeches about art at every opportunity, and the prince escaped every evening to the tavern with Gaston, the moment they were done sitting for the maestro. On the day of the unveiling of the new portrait, quite a little family party had been arranged. Tulip was in better spirits to have her mother, Queen Morningstar, there, as well as some of her ladies to attend her. Also present was Gaston, as well as a few other close friends of the prince's. King Morningstar, of course, couldn't take away from his duties at court, but sent along lavish gifts for both his daughter and his future son-in-law. After they'd feasted well on what was one of Mrs. Potts' most outstanding dinners to date, everyone went into the great hall to partake in the unveiling of the portrait. The great hall was filled with paintings, including the portraits of him that had been painted from the time he was a wee lad.
Ah, I see you hung the maestro's portrait here in the great hall, where it belongs. Good choice, old man,
said Gaston, as he looked upon faces he had grown up with.
Yes, I thought it was better suited in here.
A rather loud clearing of throat was heard from the other side of the room, where the maestro was standing. It seemed he thought the occasion required more ceremony, and this idle chat was debasing the situation at hand. Thank goodness he wouldn't have to suffer this company much longer. Yes, well, without further delay, I would like to share the latest of my greatest treasures. With that, Lumiere pulled the cord, which dropped the black silk cloth that had been concealing the painting. The room erupted into a loud clatter of sighs and applause. Everyone seemed to be highly impressed with the painting, and the maestro soaked in the praise that was being heaped upon him, like an actor on the stage would, bowing at the waist, and placing his hand upon his heart to indicate that he was very touched indeed. No doubt he actually was. The prince couldn't help noticing how harshly he'd been painted in the portrait. His eyes looked cruel, piercing, almost like those of a wolf seeking his prey. and his mouth looked thinner, more sinister than it had looked before. Gaston knocked the prince with his elbow.
"Say something, man. They're expecting a speech,"
he whispered in the prince's ear.
I couldn't have asked for a more beautiful portrait of my lovely bride-to-be,
the prince finally uttered. Princess Tulip blushed deeply and said, "Thank you, my love. And I, too, couldn't have asked for a more handsome and dignified vestige of my prospective husband." Dignified? Wasn't that a word one used for older men? Did he look dignified? His vestige, as she had called it, looked harsh and worn. Not one of a man who had not yet reached his 20th birthday, but one of a man well into his 40s. This wouldn't do. Dignified. The party was led out of the great hall and into the music room, where a group of musicians waited to entertain the party. By all accounts, the evening went on pleasantly enough, but the prince couldn't take his mind off that painting. He looked so worn, so ugly. Had Tulip agreed to marry him simply because she would eventually be queen in these lands? Did she love him at all? He couldn't see how. He slipped away from the party to confirm the maestro's rendition of him in his bedroom mirror. He just stood there staring, trying to find himself in the man staring back at him. Why hadn't anyone said anything? How could he have changed so much in so little time? Later, that evening, when the prince's guests and staff were all tucked into their beds, the prince stole out of his rooms and made his way down the long, dark corridor. He was fearful of waking Queen Morningstar. She would, of course, think he was sneaking into the princess's chamber, but that was the farthest thing from his mind now. When he passed Tulip's room, a creaking sound startled him, but it was only that blasted cat pushing the door open. He had no idea why the princess liked it so well. There was something sinister about the way the feline looked at him, and something eerie in her markings, which made her look like a creature that roamed cemeteries rather than castle grounds. Well, if the queen did wake to find him prowling the halls, she wouldn't believe he was on his way to look at his painting again. He'd been sleeping fitfully and unable to rest, his thoughts consumed by the ghastly painting. Once he got into the great hall and managed to light the candles, he stood there staring at the painting again. He had indeed changed. That had been clear when he looked at himself in the mirror earlier that evening. But surely the maestro had dramatized the changes. Just look at the difference between this painting and the last, which had been done less than a year earlier. There was no way a man could change so dramatically. He would never forgive the maestro for creating this unfavorable rendering. He decided the man must pay for such an uncharitable act. The beautiful orange and black cat seemed to be in accord with the prince, because she narrowed her eyes in much the same way he did when he plotted his revenge. At the prince's encouragement, Cogsworth had all visiting guests packed and stuffed into the carriages very early the next morning. Mrs. Potts was disappointed not to have the opportunity to serve the guests breakfast before they started their travels, so she packed a large trunk with lovely things for them to eat on their journey. The sun was barely visible, and the tops of trees were obscured in mist. There was a terrible chill in the air, so it didn't seem unreasonable that the prince was eager to get back within doors, where he could warm himself. He made his goodbyes to his guests, thanking them all and bidding them farewell, with promises of love and letter-writing to Tulip. He sighed in great relief when the carriages drove away. Gaston, who had been standing silently at his side, finally spoke.
"So why was it you woke me at this ungodly hour, my friend?"
I need a little favor. Some time back, you mentioned a particularly unscrupulous fellow who can be called upon for certain deeds.
Gaston raised his eyebrows.
"Surely there are ways to get out of marrying the princess other than having her killed."
The prince laughed.
No, man. I mean the maestro. I would like you to make the arrangements for me. The incident cannot be traced back to me, you understand?
Gaston looked at his friend and said,
"Absolutely."
Thank you, good friend. And once that is sorted, what do you say to Dave hunting?
Sounds perfect. I would like nothing more.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this reading. If you haven't had a chance to, please take a second, like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, comment down below, share with a friend, and check out some of the other Villain series chapters and books as well. Join us next time, and remember, let it go and keep moving forward. Have a magical day. Bye!